Hey guys, Sean here, and welcome to the F1 Word. Now it is finally F1 race week once again, and even though FP1 for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix is only a few days away, Formula One has only just officially confirmed the format for this sprint race weekend. Alright, fine, we were kind of given an inkling that sprint weekends were changing last time out in Australia, and we have really unofficially known it's been coming ever since, but it still feels crazy to me that we've come into a race weekend not knowing, again officially, what the format and schedule will be, but thankfully we do now. Yes, F1 is changing how a sprint weekend will work going forward, and the change is coming to effect from this very weekend in Baku. So, if you are new to F1 or have forgotten, usually when a sprint event rolls around, we'd have FP1 on Friday morning, qualifying on Friday afternoon to set the grid for Saturday's sprint race. Saturday morning would start with what for many was a bit of an irrelevant FP2 session as cars were already in Parc Fermé by that point, and the sprint itself would take place on Saturday afternoon, and the result of that would set the grid for Sunday's Grand Prix. However, it has now been confirmed that sprints will be standalone events for this season with their own qualifying sessions on Saturday morning, replacing FP2. Going forward, a sprint weekend will now start, as always, with FP1 on Friday, and that will be the only practice session of the whole weekend. Wow, there will then be the usual qualifying session on a Friday afternoon, but that now sets the grid for Sunday's Grand Prix. FP2, which was on Saturday morning, will, as I've already said, be scrapped and replaced by sprint qualifying. I'll go into all of this in a bit more detail in a moment, and that session will, shock horror, set the grid for the sprint race. And that sprint race will take place, as usual, on Saturday afternoon. However, the result of the sprint will no longer set the grid for Sunday's Grand Prix. So basically, we've got Friday practice and qualifying on Friday, obviously, and then we've got sprint Saturday and then Grand Prix Sunday. How is all this going to work then? Well, FP1 and qualifying will work as normal, with drivers and teams getting 60 minutes to get their cars set up for the weekend ahead. And as I've already said, that will be their only chance to prepare for the Grand Prix. A lot of pressure and hopefully a lot of track action on Friday morning then. Qualifying later that afternoon will be the usual 1 hour session using the familiar 3-stage knockout format. Nothing changes there except for the fact, again, as I've already said, it will set the order drivers start the race on Sunday, unless, of course, there are penalties to take into account. And just for those who want to know, cars do still go into Parc Fermé once they hit the track for Friday qualifying. Aside from being standalone and therefore not setting the grid for the Grand Prix proper, the sprint itself will largely be the same, running for a distance of 100 kilometers with no mandatory pit stops. One change is coming into force though, and was confirmed over the winter, and that is that DRS will be available from the end of lap 1 during sprint races and at the end of the first green flag lap following a safety car period. That is a trial, with the idea likely to be adopted by races proper next season if it is considered a success. The grid for the sprint race will instead be set by sprint qualifying, or as they're calling it, the sprint shootout, which will be shorter than normal qualifying. It will, though, follow the same template as qualifying on Friday with 3 knockout sessions. However, Q1 will be just 12 minutes long with all 20 drivers taking part. Q2 will be 10 minutes long with the remaining 15 drivers involved. And the top 10 will battle for P1 in Q3, and that will last for just 8 minutes. So we're probably only going to see 1 run from each driver in Q3. When it comes to the tyres, drivers will get 12 sets. That's 2 hard, 4 medium and 6 soft. And during sprint qualifying, they will have to use mandatory tyres, with Q1 and Q2 requiring new medium tyres and Q3 requiring new softs. Penalties will work differently as well, with any grid penalty occurred during FP1 Friday qualifying or the sprints being applied to the race on Sunday, whereas a grid penalty picked up in sprint qualifying will apply to the sprint race. Breaches of Parc Fermé will result in a pit lane start for the sprint and the race. Power unit penalties will only apply to the race on Sunday though, unless they are a Parc Fermé breach too. There has also been an increase of power unit elements, with drivers now getting 4 of the ICE Turbo MGUH and MGUK for this year only. That's an increase from 3. This, by the way, was all unanimously voted through by the teams. I will point out, though, that as a result of this change, we're only getting 1 hour of track action on Saturday. Yes, there will be a gap between each session in qualifying, so it'll feel on TV like it's a bit longer. But in reality, because of the shortened sessions, we've got 12, 10, and 8, which is half an hour. And then the sprint itself usually lasts for around 30 minutes as well. I suppose the counter argument to that, though, is that it is all action. We've not got a practice session where drivers sit in the garage for the first 20 minutes and don't really do a lot. We've got a fast-paced qualifying session and a fast-paced race on Saturday. What do you think of these changes to sprints then? Let me know down in the comment section. For me, this is a step in the right direction. My biggest gripe with sprints has always been that they set the grid for the Grand Prix proper, meaning that drivers were always going to be less likely to take risks by their own admission, by the way, when going for overtakes, because the last thing they wanted to do was risk a late braking move to try and snatch, for example, P9 on the grid, only to crash out and have to start the big race on Sunday from the back of the grid or even the pit lane. It also meant that when we ended up with faster cars out of position because of a chaotic or wet qualifying session, those faster drivers would make their way back to their expected position during the sprint, and we'd end up losing that potential action from the Grand Prix. What we basically had was lights out on a Saturday afternoon, a red flag after 100 kilometers had passed, and then a restart on Sunday. It never felt quite right to me. It never flowed properly. And I've been banging on since the first event that they needed to be standalone. Of course, that doesn't mean this change is perfect, far from it. I've seen a few make the very fair point of essentially what is in it for the drivers out of the points during Saturday's sprint. After all, points go from P1 to P8, and because the race doesn't set the grid for the Grand Prix, there's nothing to gain for, let's say, Kevin Magnussen in P13. At least in the Sunday race, a driver's finishing position counts for something, because in the event of a tie on points, the FIA does a countback, and the driver or team with the highest finish will end the season above the driver they were tied with come the end of the season. Think back to Caterham and Marussia in Brazil 2012, where Vitaly Petrov's P11 moved Caterham up to P10 in the constructors' standings at the expense of Marussia, winning them millions of dollars in prize money. Every position really can matter on a Sunday. With nothing on the line outside the points in these revised sprints, are we going to see drivers who look unlikely to score just cruising around and waiting for the end of the race? Or even worse, just pitting to retire with a few laps to go to save on engine mileage? I mean, look, I hope not, and I'm sure this will have been discussed and addressed. We'll see on Saturday, but I think it's a reasonable point to bear in mind. Also, just because it doesn't set the grid for Sunday doesn't mean drivers are going to go into the sprint without a care in the world and making risky moves. After all, they can still crash, yes, obvious statement, I know, and a big enough smash could still result in a pit lane start if, for example, a new chassis is needed. Despite the increase in power unit elements, they will still have to consider power unit mileage, or at least how hard they push them, because there are now an extra 6 sessions where drivers will need to push much harder than they would have done in, let's say, second practice. I suppose, though, that's always going to be an issue with these events, isn't it? The Grand Prix means so much more than a sprint ever will. Yeah, for the prestige and the record books, but more importantly for the championship. So drivers probably won't be at 100% in a Saturday race in particular. Especially this weekend, though, with Baku being a street track and Miami just 1 week later. That said, they are racers, and once the lights go out and the adrenaline kicks in, who knows how chaotic a Saturday sprint could be. Overall, though, I do like this change, and I'm pleased to see the sprints go standalone. And whilst I totally understand practice is for the teams to, well, practice and isn't really for our entertainment, I'd much rather watch a second qualifying session than an FP2 session, especially one where the cars are already in Parc Fermé. I mean, now the sprints don't set the grid for the Grand Prix, I do kind of wish they'd have at least trialled using the Friday qualifying order for the sprint, but reverse the top 10 for Saturday's race, a bit like we see in F2, for example. Even if just the once, but hey, that idea seems to get a lot of criticism from some, so maybe that's never going to happen. Perhaps even bring back one-shot qualifying to set the grid for the sprint. That would give us something a little bit different and might help mix the grid up a little bit more, let's say, organically. One more thing, if it was up to me, I'd extend points back to P10 with 10 points for the win, 9 for second, 8 for third, all the way down to 1 point for 10th place. And I've said that before, I know that for a fact. I just think that makes a lot of sense and opens up a couple more places worth fighting for. And for what it's worth, not that it really matters for us so much, I would have made FP1 90 minutes as it is the only practice session they've got for the whole weekend. It's not up to me though, thankfully, but I'm really looking forward to seeing how this all works out on Saturday. Look, I'm not one of those who thinks we should burn the sprints with fire and never speak of them again, but I'm also not one of those who thinks this is the best thing F1 has ever come up with ever. For me, they are fine, and making them stand alone is the right call. The final thing I'll add, though, is that whilst I'm happy to see F1 tweaking things like sprints to get them right, and I understand that these are still relatively new, so changes will be made to perfect them, they do need to settle on a final format for them soon. We don't need to be changing them every year and only officially finding out what the changes are 3 days before they come into force. Then again, we're just fans, so who are we, really? As long as the teams and the drivers, the FIA, the organisers all know well in advance, doesn't really matter when a press release goes out, does it? Also, you don't need to point it out, I'm fully aware of the irony of me saying that we need to settle on a format for these soon, having just spent much of this video waffling about all the things I'd change about them. Hopefully that doesn't come across as me being negative about sprints, because I'm not. I'm just being constructive and throwing my opinion out there on my channel, which is about opinions, allegedly. But anyway, that is it for this one, but don't forget you can let me know what you make of the new sprint changes in the comments section down below. And also, is there anything else you'd like to see F1 change when it comes to sprint weekends in the future? Now, I will be back on Thursday with the Azerbaijan Grand Prix preview, but in the meantime, if you did enjoy this one, then please do leave a like, because it really does help to give the channel a little bit of a boost. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos or streams. But as ever, thank you for watching. I've been Sean, this has been the F1 Word, and until next time, goodbye.